Hello, everyone. I'm Maria Lourdes Veneracion Ralionza, Director of the Asia Pacific Center for the Responsibility to Protect Philippine Office and co-chair of the Asia Pacific Partnership for Atrocity Prevention Working Group on Gender and Atrocity Prevention. Before we begin, may I please just share with you the webinar guidelines. First, only the one speaking shall be unmuted. All including participants shall be on mute. Second, participants are requested to comment and or ask questions during the chat or inside the chat or Q&A boxes. Third, when posting a question, please identify to whom he or she is addressing the question to. And last, in the event of Zoom bombing, the webinar will be immediately ended and a new webinar link will be sent to the registered participants for the activity to continue. We are now live streaming on Facebook and follow us on Twitter on @APPAP webinars for live tweets. Now allow me to introduce the activity. Launched in November 2016, the Asia Pacific Partnership for Atrocity Prevention, or APPAP, is an alliance of organizations working towards the prevention of atrocity crimes and to fostering commitment to the responsibility to protect, or R2P principle. APPAP's goal is to facilitate coherent and comprehensive action to prevent atrocities that mobilize the capacities of local, regional, and global actors. APPAP has 4 working groups, and one of which is the Working Group on Gender and Atrocity Prevention, the host of today's webinar. Our working group aims to develop a report and plan of action on preventing gender-based atrocity crimes, including links between gender violence and discrimination and early warning of atrocity crimes. This 2-part webinar series on intersecting vulnerabilities, converging transformative agencies, women, peace, and security in the time of COVID-19 is the first from APPAP and the Working Group on Gender and Atrocity Prevention. There are many similar observations as regards the gender dimension of COVID-19 pandemic from various parts of the world. Some of the gendered patterns observed in the last few months were sexual and gender-based violence in homes happening during blanket isolation, increasing burden of women's domestic labor, women's health workers as primary caregivers having greater risk of being sick themselves, and deepening of women's socioeconomic burden. Equally observed were hyper-masculine approaches to health crisis that emasculated the state further. For example, emergency powers were legislated to legalize Machiavellian measures, and a discourse of war was constructed to combat the pandemic, and the police and the military deployed in checkpoints that mushroomed along city borders. And yet, in the midst of all this strongman politics are women leaders, deploying a more effective leadership strategy, firm but compassionate, policies based on science, and transformative. The year 2020 marks the 20th year of the adoption of the United Nations Security Council Resolution 1325. Within this period, several other resolutions followed that reiterated the need to address both women's victimization in conflict and post-conflict situations, as well as women's agency in peace building and conflict transformation. Given the context of the pandemic, what is the relevance of women, peace, and security in connection with intersecting vulnerability and converging transformative agency of women in many conflict-affected areas and vulnerable communities in Asia? So with that, let me now introduce the speakers. Joining us today are 4 members of the working group who each would share their thoughts and responses to the question I just mentioned. Our first speaker is Marilia da Costa, or Bylah, as we fondly call her. Bylah has been doing civil society work for 14 years, first with the Center for International Conflict Resolution, or CICR, Columbia University, and then with NGO Belun. She is now active as a Timorese JICA Alumni Association, where she got support from JICA for training on empowerment of rural women in 2017 September at the Tsukuba Center in Tokyo, Japan. Let us all please welcome Bylah for her presentation. Bylah, you have to unmute yourself.
Hello.
Hello, thank you, Bylah. Hearing you perfectly. Thank you. Bylah, you have to unmute again, please.
Hello. Okay. Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks you, Professor Vene, and good afternoon for all our participants and the speaker in webinar series. And today I would like to present my thought. This is related to COVID-19 and its impact on women vulnerability. This topic also related to women peace and security. And then follow with my content. And then I will like to introduce what is Timorese JICA Alumni Association. The second, state emergency. Third one, COVID-19 and its impact on women vulnerability. The domestic workers, sexual violence, domestic violence, and gender-based violence happening during the COVID-19, and then vulnerable people in behind, and also case study. What is Timorese JICA Alumni Association? JICA Alumni Association is established in March 15, 2019 in Delhi. That association, JICA Association Timor-Leste, to share information for each other for the mutual cooperation and implementation new project in the field of Timor-Leste. This is related to relation with the Japan country relation as well. And then we have a vision. Our vision is to develop Timor-Leste as peace country, strong prosperity, brilliant, healthy, and harmony. Our vision is strengthening the relation between Japanese and Timorese people in the various areas. The second, utilize knowledge and experience that gained in Japan to develop Timor-Leste. Third, organize seminar, workshop, scientific research, and conference. Our objective for the JICA Alumni Association to bond the relationship of training participants and to promote transferring of technical know-how, the skill among members and others, to implement the activities of X-training after running from Japan. And now we go to the second slide, please. State emergency. In order to respond the threat for the COVID-19 pandemic in Timor-Leste has declared of state of emergency. On 27 March, the president issued decree to declare a state of emergency from 28 March until 27 June 2020. This is the first one, second one, and third one, state of emergency. And then what is the decree from president? What we want to do, the people, the community have to do. The one is focus on international circulation. This means like focus on the decree also share with the internal circulation like international NGO, bilateral. And then also public administration, vocational education and training establishing, private economic initiative, compulsory and voluntary isolation, validity period of license and authorization, administration of daily port, homeschooling, distance learning. And then, sorry, I have to begin this. Sorry. During the pandemic COVID-19, there are happening with the vulnerable women. 78 employment lose their job, not get calling from their company, and receive not salary. In addition, in the months of April until May 2020, 56 workers, including domestic workers, do not get a call back from their company and the household that they work with. The domestic workers are mainly women. There is not a specific law for them, no essentially to social protection. The total of the domestic workers as registered 280. In is against to the CEDAW Article 11 in the employment section. The information center on the COVID-19 that Timor led by Fontil and Working Women Center Timor-Leste. This document I got from that Working Women Center. Sexual violence, domestic violence, and gender-based violence happening during the COVID-19. During the COVID-19, the emergent support from civil society organization, national NGO, international NGO, church, community group, family members in the country, and countryside, women's group, and local organization working for people with a disability, political party, and then what support they give to the vulnerable people is food, material for to prevent COVID-19. From the government, support special fund for COVID-19 is subsidy, electricity poles, etc. And then also in the World Health Organization, Ministry of Health, they have good cooperation during the pandemic COVID-19, implementing public awareness to prevent COVID-19. Hello. Okay. Vulnerable people in behind. Before pandemic COVID-19, during the pandemic, the vulnerable people is effect to the state emergency. This part focus on people with a disability. Their life is depend on others because the disability people need people to help them to doing something their needs. The impact they experienced before and the situation on the pandemic was that the family itself did not prioritize them in the house. They were number two. It's example like during the pandemic, they support for the other people, but the people with disability, they support like a second to give some information. The priorities for the others. The data from the IDTL, Association of Disability Timor-Leste, registered 38.118 people with a disability around the Timor-Leste during the pandemic. That ADTL support staples food and material to prevent COVID-19. They also support for the members working on the close with the people with the disability. I just take the two case study during the pandemic. COVID-19 happened, focus on violence against girls. This is one case, a serious incident occurring sexual violence against girls aged 30 years old by her uncles. The impact to the girls is pregnant, psychologists, revenge, behavior, anger, can't sleep and cry. What she say, it still need to school and play like other children. This is during the pandemic. COVID-19 happened, sexual violence against girls. This data from the Focupers, this is women organization, registered the data, and then now the case is supported by the Focupers, women organization take part. And then the second case is from the Working Women Center. The case is about the domestic worker. She has to lose her job because of the pandemic. She support household more than 1 year with salary 120 per month to do house cleaner, washing clothes, cooking, and etc. Because because of the state of emergency, her boss stopped her with reason her boss also not work because of a state emergency. And then follow with the decree law to implement the social distance and stay home. And then her boss say that will contact her back, but until now she not calling back from her boss. It means she's still waiting until now to get the same job or other jobs she can get. It means like the impact for the woman's question. Thank you for attention. This is my presentation. I'm waiting for question and I can deeply answer for the question from the participants.
Thank you very much, Bylah, for that presentation. And what essentially you have shared is as regards job insecurity of women, concerns for domestic women workers, and the cases that you presented in terms of domestic work and gender-based violence as case studies. And very interestingly, you pointed out the increasing vulnerability and even deepening vulnerability of people with disability, and most especially, you know, if you have women who also are have disabilities, women with disabilities, essentially, you know, it's also going to be a more challenging thing. However, you also pointed out that there is support for women that came from civil society organization as well as government. So thank you for that sharing, Bylah. We will have you back again in the question and answer portion. Yeah. So can you please unmute, mute your mic now. So our next speaker is Jesuina Maria do Rosario Abel. She is currently Youth for Change Program Manager for Belun, Dili, Timor-Leste. Jesuina has been working as Belun's coordinator for political development and advocacy since November 2013. In 2014 to 2017, she worked as Belun's project leader, research coordinator for assessing legitimacy of security sector institutions, or ALTSS, funded by International Development Research Center, Canada. Previously, she held the role of director in the Directorate of Education, Campaign and Research for Timor-Leste's Anti-Corruption Commission, or CAC. Let us all please welcome Ms. Jesuina Maria do Rosario Abel. Thank you.
Thank you for the opportunity, and good evening for all panelists and the participants. Before going to respond what is the relevance in the context of the COVID-19, I'd like to explain a brief information about the overview of Timor-Leste situation. The conflict in Timor-Leste from 1975 to 1999 left nearly half of Timorese women widowed and sole providers for their families. The main vulnerabilities for women have been the vicious cycle of deep poverty and economic dependence, and lack of formal education and domestic violence. But the government has responded to these challenges with the following political, social, and economic measures. First one is about an amendment to the electoral laws that states that 33% of the political parties list must be women candidates. resulting in 38% of seats in the national parliament being women, the highest rate in the Asia-Pacific region. There have been a number of women and Vice Minister, Secretary of State positions, and also the local level one. There are currently 11 women village chiefs, 2 women sub-village chiefs, and 6 elders that function as traditional leaders, or Lianine in Timor context. Second one is about sexual and gender-based violence and domestic violence are addressed by Law Number 7, 2010 on domestic violence passed by National Parliament on 3rd of May 2010. A national action plan for the implementation of the UN Security Council Resolution 1325 was approved by the Council of Ministers in April 2016 to leave no one behind. This needs to continue. The government approved the second National Action Plan on gender-based violence on 7 of February 2017 with 4 major pillars. First one is prevention, second provision of the services for survivors, access to justice, and the last one is coordination, monitoring and evaluation of the situation. Economic measures include cash transfers program, the constitutional government, support local initiatives of women and women groups, and the Bolseda Mine, which is a measure to support widows and orphans. Please, next slide. And looking towards the future, Belun promotes youth involvement in local peace building processes by building youth capacity for conflict analysis and alternative dispute resolution. The institutional commitment to leave no one behind and reach the farthest behind first requires our youth to develop skills and take advantage of opportunities to become positive agents of structural change. Respond to the needs of change and promote youth to become peace actors in partnership with German corporation GIZ. Belun has been training youth and young girls for urban and rural areas in 2 districts to be involved in conflict resolutions through mediation processes. Although still in initial stages of skills development, 28 people who have participated in Belun training have started conducting family mediations in rural areas and within their own families in the capital of the district where they live. Some of them have had the opportunity to practice their skill in public defender office in one district in the eastern part of the country, accompanied by the senior mediators and public defenders. Also, National Directorate Land and Property Office in Delhi at Mediation Department. The lockdown due to COVID-19 has been an opportunity to showcase the importance of skills development, especially by the youth and women. However, local culture still underestimates young people deemed to lack experience and judicial training. Furthermore, culture underestimates women as men are in control and women have not consolidated power to speak in public meetings, particularly in cases involving domestic violence or land disputes, except in the regions where the matrilineal system is adopted. The next slide, some documentation about youth and young girls or young women in conflict resolution during the COVID-19 lockdown. The graphs shows action that youth or young girls realized the mediation process in their family during March to May 2020. And the picture 1, 2, and 3 shows dispute mediation instances by youth during the lockdown at Public Defender Office. And this action to support communities from urban and rural areas. Next slide, please. The ex-constitutional government plan is to continue to implement the National Action Plan on Women, Peace and Security and continue to implement campaigns to combat domestic violence. Women, peace and security relevance in the context of COVID-19. Vulnerable women who suffered loss of income, resulting in deeper economic vulnerability, domestic violence, and instances of rape, incest, high level of stress and disease at the hands of perpetrators from their own family or neighbors. Belun's our system data confirms women as victims in 82 incidences of violence, including rape, domestic violence, and sexual violence against minors during the lockdown in the month of April to June 2020. A real example of the issue, one girl that faced the problem with her uncle, Belun support refer her to the organizations that helping her to proceed her case to the judicial system. Young women without proper parental care are left to their own devices. They require support when fleeing their homes in search for immediate security and legal assistance. Women, peace and security relevance in this context of structural response to contribute to the national plans to address vulnerabilities of women and girls in Timor-Leste and find structural solution to their plight. From all of this situation, our conclusion and recommendation, next slide please. We need more intervention in the area of mass education, economic development, and cultural transformation, both at the strategic policy-making level and at the day-to-day life-changing measures at the grassroots level. Need more action, legal and social, to help women to acquire more knowledge and better skills, qualification to ensure better and diversified access to employment opportunities in order to ensure personal and professional fulfillment. And the last one, more support in the form of sustainable funding programs for the ongoing empowerment processes, particularly for youth programs on GBV and domestic violence and programs for youth leadership training. Thank you very much. That's all my slide. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jesuina. There you go. I just realized that you kept your video off as you were presenting, probably because of connectivity issues. We mentioned that it would be easier to actually connect if the video so that it is off, so that the bandwidth will not have too much difficulty. But thank you. Thank you very much. Jesuina actually ran us through the situation of Timor-Leste in terms of the youth being involved in the dispute mediation. And as you know, there is also, apart from having women, peace and security, there's also youth peace and security that is actually a component of gender. And Jesuina also shared that there is underestimation of women's capacities, and therefore they are actually excluded in talks, for example, on matters of domestic violence and land disputes, except she mentioned if it's a matrilineal society. They're similar to what Bylah mentioned. There's loss of income for a lot of women, and essentially, you know, the situation of women can give us a sense of some kind of an early warning, you know, in terms of would there be possible increasing violence and the like. What I am very interested about is what Jesuina mentioned as women, peace and security being a having a structural response, or being a structural response, particularly because of the structurality of violence as well in Timor-Leste, probably coming from the post-conflict conflict situation to the post-conflict situation. And it would be interesting to have a discussion on this matter later. So thank you very much, Jesuina. We move on to our third speaker for today. From Timor-Leste, we're now moving to Sri Lanka. Oh, no, sorry, Bangladesh. Dr. Meghna Guhathakurta taught international relations at the University of Dhaka for 22 years and is currently Executive Director of Research Initiatives Bangladesh. She specializes in issues related to gender, South Asia, and development, and is at present involved in research related to unpaid care work, humanitarian response for host and refugee communities, and displacement among the marginalized. So she will walk us through the situation of care work, unpaid care work, in her discussion. So let us all please welcome our third speaker, Dr. Meghna Guhathakurta.
Thank you very much, Vene. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon to you all, although in Bangladesh it's still morning. This presentation is not really a country presentation because although much of the experience I will be talking about is based in Bangladesh, but you will see that it has many similarities globally and from developed countries to developing countries. First, my issue here is to relate gendered notions of care within this whole in a conceptual framework. So let me talk about a little bit about background of the conceptual framework which I will be working in, and also the background that a lot of which my preceding speakers have said, they also fit into it. So one is the thing about structural feminist standpoint issues, which is basically looking at women as a marginal political subject, from where they will be, they are sort of, they are the center point of a perspective which can deal with, say, because they have been dominated historically and structurally, they are less ideologically invested in the status quo and hence more prone to change. And that is where the crux of women's leadership come in. So in many crises and in many emergency responses, such perspectives become very important to make changes, whether it is in policies or programs or practice. The other viewpoint is a post-structural feminist standpoint, which says that no, it's just not enough to say about women. Women are different. I mean, they are racially different, they are ethnically different. So you cannot homogenize it. And homogenization only reinforces gender stereotypes. So a lot of debate and conversation between the two groups have happened. Both have been, has their positive and negative implications. But what has resulted is what is called the intersectional approach. And I believe that our webinar also contains the word intersectional, so it's important. And here we try to, here feminists try to locate gender as an intersection of various forms of subordination. So it means that they're not looking at women as a monolithic unit or representation, but but also in their intersections with regard to race, ethnicity, sexual and colonial hierarchies. So even in one single country, we may have differences like in Bangladesh, racial differences, ethnic differences, religious differences, and women from each of these sectors can have different priorities, and they can, you know, have different perspectives on the problem. So that is very important in our analysis. And finally, a little bit more that I would like to, which my presentation hinges on, is the ethics of care. And feminists for a long time have looked at ethics of care, but have not been listened to much. However, the main premise is, or underlying premise is that the central role of that care plays, and in the relation and other relational moral practices in everyday lives of the people and in all settings. And specifically when we are looking at the pandemic, it comes to this, care has become a very important notion all over again. And I will see how that reflects in policies and practices at various levels. So next slide, please. We now look Thank you. We now look at how to address the pandemics. Now, we know that the pandemic is like a disaster or an emergency response, although it has long-term implications as well. So I will look at it in two different ways. First, in the short-term emergency response way, and in the long-term policies and institution building, which it implicates that we should be doing. So in a way, for Bangladesh, for example, every country has a DRR policy, that is disaster risk and reduction program or policies inbuilt in their strategies. But mostly, and Bangladesh has been quite renowned for that because it has sort of felt disasters, but mostly they are about natural disasters like cyclones, floods, a little bit on environmental degradation, which comes from climate change, etc., has been linked to. But and also there is that other aspect called the humanitarian response, where in Bangladesh we know it is housing about close to 1 million refugees, Rohingya refugees from Myanmar, and therefore a part of Bangladesh is where the refugees actually outnumber the local people. So the programs related to that is also conceived within an emergency response. But how far have we, factored in pandemic related situation to this? Almost none, because we were left almost unprepared. Like, as in many countries, policies were taken ad hoc basis and on a very urgent and day-to-day basis rather than a long-term vision. So first of all, what it throws light on is the in looking at a pandemic from an emergency point of view, we have to look at how the nature of a pandemic is comparing to other natural disasters is different. It's different in many ways. For example, there's social distancing and lockdown, which creates mobility restrictions in a way that there is not there if a flood or a cyclone happens. So a flood or a cyclone may happen in one part of the country, but the rest of the country has free movement, and they can compensate resources from the other parts very easily. So, but a pandemic, the lockdown prevents that. So prevents immediate relief and recovery, which may take place much quicker in other kind of disaster situations. Pandemic also has affected the whole of the nation and not a single single part of the country. So, and in a way, it has also impacted on social cohesiveness. A lot of our, in developing countries, disaster-ridden situations, a lot of resilience is their local resilience, and social cohesiveness acts to help counter the immediate disaster, meaning community-led activities may happen. Now, the pandemic has created restraints on this because they have sometimes, for example, just simple example, like if you have economic difficulties, you usually borrow. You borrow from whom? You borrow from your trusted people, family, or even shopkeepers sometimes. But here, the pandemic has affected the whole population. So they cannot go on even the social resilience that would be there, that people started borrowing. And we've investigated in the camp areas, in the local communities, people were saying that, yes, we borrowed at first, but then there was the people who borrowed from also were borrowing, and they had nothing to give to us. So, and that extra recovery was not there. So that's how it's affected it negatively. But positively, we also look how people come up with a lot of interesting devices and ways in which to counter it by using social cohesiveness very creatively. For example, during the pandemic occurred almost at the time of Eid vacations or Eid holidays. And there was during, it's a Muslim festival where there's a lot of giving and donations like zakat, which is a kind of Islamic tax, which people pay for. And this kind of zakat system helped to override many of the deficiencies, the lack of food, the lack of healthcare, and purchasing, daily purchasing power, and gave it to the people. So very interesting sort of ways in which social cohesiveness can affect pandemics both positively and negatively. Also, it didn't end in pandemics. Pandemics combined in a particular region with the cyclone Amphan, which recently hit Bangladesh and its neighboring countries very badly. And there we see again the natural disaster was mechanisms was inadequate because people had to be taken to shelter. Shelters were congested, did not have proper space or social distancing. Masks were not, always very readily available in disaster areas. So these were the conditions where we really have to look at the situation, look deeply into how pandemics should be incorporated within the normal short-term emergency humanitarian responses that we have. It also created specific gendered contexts, and I won't go into details because a lot has already been mentioned by my colleagues from Timor. They talked about violence against women and domestic violence, but very interestingly, although the UN Secretary General has said that this should be a priority, that domestic violence and violence against women during pandemic should be a priority, but we've seen in the refugee camps that there were not violence against women was not considered to be a critical service in the camps. It was critical services constituted shelters, food, and repair, emergency repair works, etc., but not violence against women. And health was definitely there, but not so much mental health as physical health. So this is a very interesting example. And also, when we look at the essential services, we see a lot of essential services not getting adequate protection in terms of PPEs. And this has been, even before the pandemic, I was doing a work with solid waste management in the local population and refugee populations. And we saw that there was a distinction between women who were given standardized PPEs. And by the way, these essential workers were considered critical services even during the pandemic, because the government issued an order and they were cleaners, sweepers, from the municipality, and they were asked to attend daily work, whereas officers weren't. So even we see that there are problems about issuing standardized PPEs because it wouldn't fit women, or it would be culturally impractical for women to put on boots underneath a sari, and all kinds of things. And they weren't, and institutionally, they were not prepared to handle this even in normal times, to give differentiated PPEs for the protection of women and maybe disabled or even petite men, because they were designed for 6-foot men or 8-foot, and the vendoring and the tendering that occurs in institutional practices was not handling it properly. So we also have, like in many other countries, the labor migration, the problems that our friends mentioned was also there in South Asia. We know that in Bangladesh specifically, 90% of essential RNG factory workers are women who have to feed their families and take care of their children at the same time. They were thrown out of job and they were asked to go back to their homes without even proper transportation. And then suddenly there was a kind of ad hoc decision between public and private sector. There was no synchronization. So the women came back to, or else they feared that they would lose their jobs. And then the factory decided not to open again. So they were left out, practically out in the streets to fend for themselves. So, and of course, and we know that women have unpaid care work. In Bangladesh, studies say that 7.5 hours they spend, a rural woman, rural woman spends 7.5 hours in cooking, cleaning, looking after children, whereas men spend 1.5 hours. So if that is so, then we know that this, in the days of the pandemic, where lockdown, where women were enclosed in their houses with more people to feed all the time, more people to take care of, elderly children, as well as their husbands. So it really created a problem. And so now we come to specific care needs. We've all heard of the health system being neglected, it's true. And, but it's not only in an epidemiological sense that I mean care infrastructure. I like more ventilators, more hospitals, more nurses, more care workers, yes, but also the quality of care. Once you're hospitalized, social distancing prevents families from visiting their loved and dear ones. And we know that in developing countries like Bangladesh, where there is almost zero or minimal health system, it is the family which takes over. So the families spend rushing around if a person is ill, rushing around, looking after medicine, giving them food where the hospital care is not enough for the food security. So all these were aggravated in the pandemic more because they weren't allowed to go to the corona units to visit their families. Many were left to die on their own. There was also the case of essential care workers, and I've mentioned that before, so I won't repeat it. But family roles in the pandemic have also changed, and how they've changed is yet to know. So when we look at this specific care needs, we are also looking at whether family roles in the pandemic can be helped or strengthened in some ways, in more creative ways than it has been done so here. All this implicates not only that we should be looking at it as an emergency response, but also looking at it in terms of long-term policies and institution building. So basically, first we talk about social protection. And it includes, it's envisioned not only as a stimulus package, but as a long-term measure. There is the UK Women's Budget Team had constantly said that a balance between, so basically it means really looking and revisiting debates between a balance between market dynamics and protective instruments. So many people fear that if we go back to protective instruments and the welfareism and like before, we will be, people won't be looking after themselves as they were doing in the creation of market dynamics. But this UK Women's Group has said that women, they do need to invest more in social infrastructure rather than physical infrastructure, and that and both state and family dynamics need to be taken into account in social protection, and therefore data must exist not only at an individual level as the epidemiological policies have been doing, but also at the household level, at particular households, and see how the dynamics within a household can help towards creating the social protection as well. Also, a Washington-based study has said that women are largely employed in the informal sector where such provisions do not usually have legal guards, and also that in a factory, you can fall back on trade unions as an existing institution to look after welfare, but there is none so in the informal sectors. Also, unpaid care work, which a woman does within the household, is not recognized by most national governments or in their budgets. Institutionalization, a lot of institutions need to be built or strengthened, and more because again, looking at a report from Oxfam, which says that 2.3 billion people will need care by 2030. So the amount of care that is aging population and rising care work burden is increasing, and because more of both population as well as cuts in the sector, and it's creating a crisis. So again, I think another point to make is it's just not simply talking about health, more hospitals, more care staff, but the healthcare too also must be comprehensive. Pandemic has created a division between physical and mental health care. So mental health care has been ignored. It was been ignored before, but also in pandemics, it has increased the kind of mental anxieties that people have to undergo. It's not being taken care of. And also in terms of terminal patients, in the last webinar series, we heard that the SRHR has been a problem, especially to women. But similarly, we newly built isolation corona units are also lacking coordination between cardiac units. As I mean, my own class friend has been really affected by I mean, she died because she was a cardiac patient, and then she developed COVID, and then she was taken to the corona unit. But in the last minute, she had a massive heart attack. And in that corona unit, the adequate and appropriate cardiac facilities were not there. So these are, I do really talk about comprehensive healthcare as something to advocate in the future. Finally, prevention is the byword of the whole thing, because we have to talk about early warning systems for pandemics, because we have been told that future pandemics will also occur. Very interestingly, the more successful Southeast Asian states have been those who had faced SARS epidemic before, and they had already some institutions like Taiwan or Singapore, who've had institutions who faced this, the testing, the tracking systems before. So prevention also needs to be gender-based and diverse, because it's important to listen to women's voices and how they face the pandemics as opposed to other communities. And of course, the more marginalized communities here are not listened to at all. And finally, long-term recovery has to be not only in terms of immediate recovery packages, but let's look at the pandemic lessons now and see the different lessons, the learned lessons from different countries. Different countries have had different experiences in this, and it'll be, I think, worthwhile to look at it as building up future models for this long-term recovery, as long-term recovery models on the basis of this experience that we've had. So on the next slide, finally, we go to some recommendations. The next slide, please. Yes. So look at it, the recommendations. It's mostly advocacy recommendations that civil society organizations and women's organization and youth or development organizations have to look into. So we believe that in the local, I've divided it up into locality, although they're interlinked. So the local level, the specificities of the pandemic should be recorded. It's like those areas where it shows more, more cyclone disasters, for example, So they should be looked at it in a particular geographical way in terms of pandemics as well as dealing with cyclones and other things. And because of lockdown and mobility restrictions, which may occur again in the future, we must have local cores of workers in the locality itself. The presence in the locality must be there. Also, it's also true that as we're seeing the second spikes, that it's occurring in specific spots rather than the whole country. So definitely more decentralization of healthcare systems and appointment of more health workers in the localities is important. And to increase, of course, the facilities there. And women-led responses to disasters must include pandemics as well, for the same reason that I mentioned before. In the national level, and I said the UK-based team budget team have constantly said that governments and politicians should be made to realize that the positive multiplier effect on the economy of investing in social infrastructure, in essential social services, is much greater than investment in physical infrastructure. Building bridges, of course, it's important, but looking after healthcare workers and their protection needs is even more, as we've seen. I remember that, and even for the economy, when the laborers need to be sent back to the economy, but they need to be protected. And also the better investments also in electricity, water, sanitation, childcare, and healthcare and education through a diverse lens. Culturally, specificities should be taken into account. Religious problems, religious restrictions, religious ethnicity, and remote areas, they should all be factored into these investments. And I've already talked about comprehensive healthcare planning, and I think it should really receive a priority in our advocacies. Globally, and when you even look at organizations like WHO, UN, and their strategies, I mean, they should really not just give meaning, they should give meaning to violence. We're looking at violence against women and other essential care services as critical services. They're in their own management plans and in their own organizational plans. And the DRR, which is disaster risk and disaster risk reduction, should incorporate responses to pandemics in a gendered and diverse ways. And we should be revisiting social protection globally and find gender-sensitive models suited for pandemics. We have a lot of very interesting examples like New Zealand, like Iceland, like Germany, who have done far better than others in terms of addressing the pandemics. And why have they done that? That should be researched into properly. And finally, another thing which I didn't include in the slides, but it's I've just thought about it, that decent work has been one of the issues that European Union and other agencies have given priority to, but we haven't looked at decent works being embedded into essential care services during pandemics. I think it's about time we do that. And thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Meghna. Such a comprehensive view and great insight into the short-term and long-term responses to the pandemic, gender-sensitive responses to the pandemic, as well as comprehensive multi-level recommendation that you had. It's very, very helpful. You know, it's in a way, people usually look at the responses to the pandemic as probably isolated cases as well as examples, and then we don't really realize that there's so much similarity that we actually have to see to establish patterns and to actually see into what works and what doesn't work, particularly in relation to the situation of women. We have a question for you, Madam. I think it is in the messenger as well as in the chat box. And we'll go back to you, Meghna. Thank you very much. So our last speaker for our webinar is Dr. Tamara Nair, who is a research fellow at the Center for Non-Traditional Security Studies, or NTS Center, at the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies, or RSIS, Nanyang Technological University in Singapore. Her background is in development studies, and her current research focuses on issues of power and the biopolitics of labor and technology, and women, peace, and security agenda in Southeast Asia. Let us all please welcome Dr. Tamara Nair.
Thank you very much, Madam Moderator. Good afternoon, everyone. So I'm here today to speak about a not very explored area of WPS, and I'm kind of going to do a little mashup. So we're going to look at women's economic security in WPS, and also as how it's reflected in this current situation of COVID-19, and then we'll see how that goes. Okay. Anyway, I think, and I'm obviously not the only one here, that there's a particular area of the WPS agenda that needs further prioritization, and that is of women's economic security. And this is especially so now, given all the economic downturns, and certainly in the coming years ahead. Now, although the pandemic is not a conflict setting, it is certainly a humanitarian crisis. So we can look at it in terms of how WPS is actually going to be utilized, or going to be, the WPS agenda is going to be realized in this setting. And also the idea of women's economic security, or women's economic empowerment, as it is more popularly known in UN circles and also within the WPS agenda, is not, as far as the agenda is concerned, it's not really a new thing. Resolution 1889 of WPS agenda recognizes the constraints that undermine ability to engage women in economic decision making, and Resolution 2122 also looks at the women's economic empowerment for peace building. Okay, I'm already on the next slide. Thank you. Now, as mentioned, women's economic security is extremely important, and we should also see it as a very vital pathway when we talk in terms of sustainable peace. But if you look at how the agenda is realized, how the WPS agenda is realized, or how it is being described, both whether within the UN system, or whether within national action plans, or even in the ASEAN joint statement on the realizing of the WPS agenda in the region, the focus tends to be on the protection pillar and participation to a slighter degree. And of course, there is no doubt, and it cannot be stressed enough, that women and girls do need protection in conflict and post-conflict settings, and of course in any humanitarian crisis. However, we need to also consider that if you look at just the protection pillar, this particular aspect does not really require much change in the minds of policymakers. There is no need for a massive shift, because they already see women as victims, as helpless, and as helpless victims in need of protection. So when we think of it in this way, and we look at it mostly from the protection pillar, we then fail to engage with the agenda's transformative appeal. That means we fail to engage with how the agenda can help with broad changes across the board. And so basically what we need to do is we need to understand women's security as comprehensive security. If we do not look into the WPS agenda from this angle of intervention, especially as is seen here in Southeast Asia, in the wider Asia Pacific, and maybe even globally, the understanding and the operation of the agenda is very easily hijacked by the militarized understanding of security as far as the WPS agenda is concerned. So when you explore interventions to adopt a comprehensive security approach, you inevitably will need to investigate power relations between genders. So not only the relationship between the social construct of men and women, but also between men in power and other genders. We focus on protection, the protection pillar in WPS very often, because our ideas are sculpted by the imagined female victim who is helpless. This is not necessarily untrue, especially when you talk in terms of crisis situation, but that is not the only version of women. We must not forget that many women are resilient and resourceful. Actually, all women tend to be resilient and resourceful, especially in terms of crisis situations. And this has been seen many times in this part of the world, especially in the aftermath of natural hazards and conflicts, and certainly in this time of the COVID-19 pandemic. So we don't use these opportunities, and I call them opportunities. I know they're disasters and they're crises, but they can also be opportunities that have been presented by these crises for change. And so if we don't use this, we waste a chance to actually sort of engage with the transformative agenda of WPS and change discriminatory systems. And yes, we certainly should build back better. And I know this phrase has been thrown around, but we can also build back different. Because if we just look at the existing system and hope to make it more resilient to future crises, we are not changing anything, and we're especially not changing the power systems or the power relationships that exist within the existing system. And if you want to see any form of change, and if you want to look towards gender equality, the one thing that needs to be addressed is this power relationship. The next slide, please. Okay, now with some of my speakers have already mentioned hang on just a minute. Some of the participants, my colleagues have already mentioned structural violence. So in very broad strokes, it's basically a form of violence where your social structures and institutions sort of create and perpetuate inequality. And it's of the most dangerous kind of violence because it is not obvious and it is everywhere. Okay. The global pandemic and the lockdown and the closure of economies have shown and will go on to show unprecedented adverse impacts on the working lives of women. Structural violence, which exists within governance, systems of governance that are taken for granted, dangerously normalized and depoliticized, will serve to make these, the suffering of these women greater and disproportionate to the suffering of everyone who is impacted by this pandemic. Now, structural violence, for example, economic, can be reflected in economic inequalities, whether it's the availability of jobs, the type of jobs, the remuneration, they all affect the economic security of women. And we have to also bear in mind that establishing economic security for women is a way that other human securities, including that of health, food, and even individual securities can be realized or can be measured. So it allows women a level of freedom. It certainly prevents further victimization through forced prostitution, slavery, human trafficking, and a host of other vile operations women may be forced into just to survive, both during and in the aftermath of any form of humanitarian crisis. But just offering women employment opportunities, there is a need for care in the type of economic opportunities that are provided when we talk in terms of the restoration of jobs. Because it can, under the guise of financial independence or economic security, and this empowerment might merely perpetuate further structural violence through skewed power relations in the workplace. So what is required then, together with peace building and other capacity building efforts, is to put forth liberating and empowering economic strategies for women. The term empowering is actually, well, it is a word used by feminist scholars, especially those looking at development, but it is all easily, but it's a term also easily hijacked by a lot of institutions of global governance to mean just putting women into the existing neoliberal system. Okay, now that is a different presentation altogether. But anyway, let's just get back here. So when I say that what is needed is to put forth liberating and empowering economic strategies for women, what I mean is, well, firstly, we are engaging with the transformative nature of the agenda, of the WPS agenda, and allowing for economic opportunities where women can have a say in how such opportunities will be operationalized. For instance, giving them the ability to organize, to meet their needs, like being able to allocate their time between work in the public and private lives, and certainly fair remuneration for work being done. Next slide, please. So I have 3 policy prescriptions here, just to sort of tie up everything that I've spoken about. The first one is to focus on a comprehensive gender security rather than an instrumental understanding of the WPS agenda. Okay, what I'm trying to say here is there needs to be a shift in the conventional understanding of women's security. The WPS agenda needs to be relocated from being a state-centric or militaristic concept and moved into the realms of economics, politics, and socio-cultural space. We can actually look into making this change now because we sort of have, in some places, a dismantling of these systems, well, certainly economic systems. And maybe even the socio-cultural place, and perhaps even the political space. It is in these realms that we see the play of power relations that can create human and in particular women's economic insecurities. It is also in these realms, politics, economic, socio-cultural space, that we understand the nature of crisis better. And so we are better prepared for prevention, which is also a very important pillar in the WPS agenda, rather than just focusing on the protection aspect. The next policy prescription I have is to adopt a rights-based approach to women's security. Now, women's security and women's rights are not necessarily 2 distinct concepts. Women's rights are human rights, of course, and if we align women's security towards a human rights framework, we are more likely to engage in wider conversations of women's insecurity. Now, it has already been discussed elsewhere that CEDAW, or the Convention for Elimination Against All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, and its general recommendation, in particular, General GR 30, allows for drawing the WPS agenda into the intersecting spheres of security and human rights. So basically, it is when you look at WPS and we look at General Recommendation 30, we see where the WPS agenda, CEDAW, and human rights all align. So where rights of women are being trampled, including their economic rights, and here I give myself permission to, sort of describe this pandemic situation almost like, well, I wouldn't say it's a conflict situation, but certainly a humanitarian crisis. We can see how when we align WPS, CEDAW, and human rights, we can see and we can sort of address women's rights being trampled, and in particular, the right to education, the access to healthcare, and the right to employment. Okay, my third policy recommendation is to frame sustainable peace within sustainable development. That peace is linked with economic development and growth is well understood. Sorry, that inclusive peace, inclusive economic development and growth is linked to sustainable peace is well understood. And one of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals highlights gender inequality, specifically, which is Goal 5. Securing gendered and sustainable peace requires working across the architectures of politics, development, economics, and human securities and human rights. Now, the SDG aims to bring these together, and gender equality is vital to this process. So the WPS agenda then should seek to draw an alliance with sustainable development and SDGs to pursue a gendered security that is comprehensive and is essentially a political enterprise. So just to round off, When we speak of the term gender, we are actually being very sedate. Gender is more palatable to policymakers. It allows for women's issues to be discussed versus important issues like finance and economics, defense and national security. They're not seen as the same, although they should be related. And gender doesn't seek, when you talk in terms of gender issues, when you talk in terms of gender policies, it doesn't seek to readdress power systems. So it becomes more acceptable. You're not really looking to make any massive changes. But when we talk in terms of feminist thinking or feminism, it's got a bit of a bad rep. But when we examine these matters in WPS and what I've talked about, we are in fact employing a feminist lens, and that's how we need to look at these matters, because feminist is political and it seeks changes and it seeks to examine power, who has it and how it is used. Now, when we talk in terms of this particular pandemic, when we talk in terms of the economic insecurity of hundreds of thousands of women, most of them in informal labor in this region, in the wider Asia Pacific region, and even globally, we need to address their insecurities, and we need to have political discussions about this. And therefore, we need to employ a more feminist lens rather than just speaking about it in terms of protection, speaking in terms of just participation or just putting them into existing systems. We need to look at broader change, and we need to engage very closely with the transformative agenda of WPS. Yes, and I will end my presentation there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Tamara. Thank you. So, you know, what I have actually gathered from your presentation essentially is building better, but probably adding as well, building meaningfully and purposively, especially if we are actually up against systemic power relations.
Yes.
And in the sense, wait, let me just mute people. There is, yeah, all right. So in that sense, you've also mentioned the militarized security approach, and this is not something unique in a single country. In fact, this has been quite the impression for many countries, particularly those who have strong men in power. And later on, I have a question here for you, and so that I could ask in terms of the appropriateness, in fact, of looking at WPS or Women, Peace and Security in economic security. I mean, is it actually enough, or is it even the only lens that we should be looking at? So I'll get back to you, Tamara. Okay, so in that sense, I would now open the floor for the questions. And I actually messaged some of the questions to our panelists, and probably now you could answer. So this is the first round of questioning. May I invite other participants to actually ask their questions? You may do so using the chat box or Q&A box in Zoom, or the chat box in Facebook Live. You can also do that. We have people monitoring the chat boxes. So for Jesuina and Bylah, in the context of Timor-Leste, did the women's situation worsen during COVID-19? Can you give examples in the case of Dili or outside of the city? So this question is for Bylah and Jesuina. I'll read the question for Meghna as well. You mentioned about working with refugee women. Can you share more on their situation during this pandemic, in particular in Cox's Bazar, for example? And my question to Tamara, so the pandemic has made women more economically insecure and further disempowered. So how can WPS pillar on participation advance to address this, or is WPS even enough as an institutional framework to actually resolve this issue? So that is the first round. Ladies, can you please now address the question? Thank you.
Okay.
Bylah, you may want to.
Yeah, I want. I think we can say that there have many similar observations as regarded to gender dimension of the COVID-19. I think from my view, I was found that what is happening with the women's as a words in the situation, especially in Delhi. For example, the women lost their job because of pandemic. They can't do anything. They can moving around because of state of emergency. And then some women, she work only focus on take stone and sand to sell to the community to buy. But because of a state emergency, she can get money from that, because every day she only work in the river to get the stone and sand, and also and then she's selling to spend, to get the money to spend to their family. This is the one. This is like very vulnerable women working in the river to find the things to get the money. The second is because of the state emergencies, also impact for the family members. When we're talking about the women as a vulnerable, but also in family members. For example, like a husband's work to fill in the rabbis, looking for the rabbis around Delhi to get the money. For example, like a bottle, bottle, and then also some other thing to change the money or to get the money from that. This is also happen in the family, not only the women, but also in the family members. Also, they facing the challenges. Is very, very, very poor. And then COVID-19 is the impact, and then everyone can see in around Delhi. We thought this in Delhi is the people life is better. People life is can access everything, but no. We also have like in the some village, we can say like a rural area, even in around Delhi. There's some places like a very poor, very situations very impact because of COVID-19. They can go outside, they can go to the market, they can sell in their thing, they can sell in their vegetable or some to get the money. This is the one, this impact. And then also during the pandemic, also they get the support from the civil society, like I mentioned before, civil society, also women's group, youth group, and then also from the church. They also support the things to the community, to help the community. They identify the family members, how many they can support. This is the one is during pandemic. I think until now, the woman is still suffering. For example, like the woman does not get the job back from the boss. This is the one is still happen because they lose their job. They lose the job because of the situation. Yeah, I think that one maybe others can others ideas can respond.
Thank you very much, Bylah. Jesuina, please. You can unmute yourself. Jesuina, I can't hear you. Can you please unmute? Unmute, yeah.
Yeah,
there you go. Thank you.
Yes, because our data during the pandemic, 82 incidences during the lockdown, but only from areas covered by our system from 6 municipal with 18 administrative posts. It is higher in the eastern part. But out of that, Justice Monitoring System Program also have a monitoring system that cover all the municipals in the Timor-Leste. It shows the higher incidences that faced by women in Timor-Leste. But the good things that happen here is so many people and the organizations taking initiatives to helping each other, especially on basic needs. day-to-day needs. So deal to the economic issues, I think deal with the economic issues, I think it is a good thing happen here because people taking initiatives, organization, youth and the church, also government gave the subsidy to all families in the situation of COVID-19. So, and vulnerable family. So, despite all the situation we faced, deal with the COVID-19, we thank to government that can help families, especially vulnerable families, and also organization and civil society also taking initiative to help people with vulnerabilities in the whole country.
Thank you very much, Jesuina. So that is the situation in Timor-Leste. May I have now Meghna to respond to the question asked of her?
Yes, I gave a little bit in writing, but I will answer the question more specifically to how women refugees in the camps have been faring during the pandemic. Women refugees in camps have generally been subjected to a lot of domestic violence as well as violence outside their homes. When they go to collect firewood, they are so this is has been the general nature of things, and the justice system in the camps is such that there are these systems which are being dealt with the local leaders called majis, and but usually in terms of violence, basically there are some legal aid NGOs who are giving certain specific high-profile cases they are attending to and taking them towards justice, various kinds of justice systems, and also giving them counseling and psychological help as well. However, as far as my experience goes, that during the pandemic, the camps were subjected to a lockdown. That means other than critical services, no one was allowed to go into the camps. So even our organization, which has some kind of work with the local as well as refugees, we have stopped our activities there. But the legal aid organizations also complained that they were having to sit outside Cox's Bazar in their cars for a long time in order to get in, because they were not getting permission to help with these violence, high-profile violence cases. Instead, when we asked the refugees that how they dealt with violence against women cases during the pandemic, they said that most of them were being arbitrated through the Machi system, which is the local system. We know that the local system, which works effectively for other things, but not very effectively for violence against women, because they are mostly led by men, and it is usually a gathering of elderly male refugees. And although the usual oversight that had been given to them, that were being given to them by UN agencies or NGOs, were absent. So we fear that although it has not been reported very objectively yet, but we fear that the violence may have increased during the pandemic. Another issue of violence which comes is that it's a very expansive area, this whole refugee camp. It covers almost 2 districts. I mean, 1 big district, 2 sub-districts. And often the refugees live side by side with local population. Now, the pandemic itself is a stigma issue, because refugees also are a stigma issue, and the two have doubled up, have complicated itself. usually you can give an example. In the past year, in 2018 or 17, there was cases of diphtheria which were recorded in the camps. And that also gave rise to stigmas, saying that, oh, they bring the disease from Myanmar, or they bring they are the ones who are affecting the local populations. But it actually has been the other way around. It is the local population in this case which have been affected first, and then they affected the refugees. So it's not, and because the refugees are under a direct control, and because they had this experience of diphtheria before, so the medical institutions and the medical organizations and the sort of how to handle epidemic crisis, that wasn't a pandemic, that was an epidemic or a beginning of one, crisis, to handle epidemics. So in a way, they were half prepared, and the institutional facilities that are there have taken mandatory measures on handling on pandemic issues. So that has restrained the spread of the pandemic among the refugees as much as it could, or else they were prepared. I mean, I know NGOs who were asked to build graveyards, extra graveyards in the camps, and they did have, and they did do that, but those in charge of site management. But the records of death has been minimal in the case of the refugees. So, but the tension is great. The local population, without any reason, of course, in playing the blame game, has called the refugees, have asked, told everyone that, oh, the refugees are the responsible ones for the spreading the pandemic, whereas it's the other way around. So the tensions between resource distribution among refugees and how it's affecting the local population has also been an issue. So, and because with the restriction of resources in the area, and Cox's Bazar was under severe lockdown just until just a few days ago. And so it has affected the local economy in a bigger way than it has before. And of course, the blame game is being played, and it is the refugees that are being blamed for it. And hence the tensions have increased.
Thank you very much. Tamara?
Thanks for your questions, Vinay. So I just want to check. The first question is, how can WPS, especially the participation pillar, be used to address economic insecurities? Or whether it can in the first place. I would say yes, but I think one of the most important ways we can get the participation pillar to work in favor of building economic securities of women is to sort of move away from the thinking of the instrumental understanding of WPS. Because when we think in terms of, okay, women's economic empowerment is good because it facilitates the attainment of other goals. So, you know, in terms of smart economics in that sense. So when we have this type of thinking, we are not actually empowering women. So when you're asking for women's participation, it's not so much as them coming and sitting at the table, but more of them coming to the table and redefining and sort of reinterpreting the problem and what needs to be done. So if we and so when we do that kind of change, or that kind of when we employ that kind of thinking and that kind of strategy, we are in fact giving them a more liberating empowerment in that sense. So in that way, the participation pillar, if we adopt it in that manner, is certainly useful when we think about increasing the economic security of women. Your next question, whether WPS is in fact enough to address economic insecurities, certainly not, because economic empowerment is not a mandate of the Security Council. they're looking at, basically security, international peace. So and if you look at the resolutions itself, you will see a lot of them don't really talk about economic security per se, but they sort of, especially in terms of peace building and then sustainable peace. But there is mention of economic empowerment. 1889, 2122, but once again, I think it's a very instrumental approach rather than an empowering or liberating approach for women, as in giving them the decision on what they want and the kind of strategies that need to be used. A better way of addressing economic insecurities of women, I think, would be to use CEDAW as an instrument. We must try and use instruments that are available. That would make more sense than to fight for things that are not there and to sort of build up from the ground. So if it is already there, and certainly in a humanitarian crisis situation, yes, WPS would be a good instrument to use when we want to talk about building up economic security of women, but it can't be the only framework. We also need to tie it to things like CEDAW. We need to tie it to things like even UDHR, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the country's own policies, and how all these other instruments can be adapted and looked at. So it should be more than just WPS. WPS would be one tool.
All right, thank you very much. In fact, Tamara, one of our members in the working group, Debbie Stothard, mentioned in the Facebook chat, one strong thread emerging from both webinars is that women's economic security, including decent work and social security, is necessary to WPS. One lesson learned from the pandemic is the urgency to strengthen this aspect in the WPS discourse. But at the same time, you also mentioned that, yes, WPS, very, very important, very relevant, but should not be the only thing that we should be looking at. So thank you very much for that, Tamara. Probably, I got muted. Or probably this one would be for all panelists, whoever might want to answer. How can we push for women's inclusion or leadership in the time of COVID-19? So how can we push for women's inclusion or leadership in the time of COVID-19? What do you think women can uniquely contribute to moving forward with our lives? I would assume this is moving forward outside of the pandemic. Any thoughts from any of our panelists?
Yes, okay. I can say something to start the ball rolling, if that's okay.
Yes, madam, it is okay.
Okay, so yeah, I also try to address it in a little way, but a lot of our existing practices is based on community-led responses in disaster time, and women matter a lot in those. I've talked about social cohesiveness and resilience within the community as a factor, and in communities in Bangladesh, for example, although there may be male leadership, dominant leadership, but women within are quite engaged within their own communities, neighborhoods, even in an urban setting, neighborhoods. So I think future programs should really address the strength that women have in mobilizing resources, both physical and mental and otherwise social, to strengthen their leadership roles in such an area. And it is something that is doable already, and it needs to be further strengthened. And then once it's strengthened, I think one can push for, and at similar times when we can look to upscaling these, where there is already there in substantive proportion, you can upscale it to a national level, perhaps. So that's my thoughts on it.
Thank you. Tamara, please. Tamara, you're muted.
I'm muted.
Tamara,
Okay.
there.
Yes. Okay. So what I'm saying is that this might run counter to what I've actually said in my presentation, but I'm actually thinking that if you want, you know how they sort of have this notion of women in the home and women as carers and women as nurturers. And I can't think of a better time to utilize this and get women involved, because it really affects all the way from, you know, from state to society to home, and you're looking at children being affected and homes being, people being sick. And if you want to have that kind of thinking about women being in, you know, being involved in all these things, then that's how you should actually be including them as a result of that in this COVID-19 pandemic. But I'll, you know, but I don't, even in such a situation, right, even with such thinking and with such stereotypical thinking of what women should be doing, we don't really see a lot of women in the national task force of COVID-19. Like in the case of Singapore, I don't, well, maybe there is a woman, I'm not even sure, but you know, why aren't we actually, if you want to think of women and you have such a stereotypical idea of what women do and how they are and their value in society and all that, that should be the reason why you should be including them more during this period. But even then we don't see it. So I would say use that thinking, get them in, but you know, from there it needs to change. Like you can't, like you need to change from that point. The point is to get them in, and then from there sort of have more discussions and sort of take in their input.
Thank you very much. What about Bylah or Jesuina?
Yeah. Okay.
Go ahead.
I think from my side, I'm also the one is like I lose my job. My contract is finished with Belun, and then after that I doing a lot of activity in myself with the others women's girls. I established the one group. During the pandemic, I established one group we call Blue Action Group. Blue Action Group is we want to working with the woman vulnerability. The woman is affect or impact from their job because of their job is the contract is end, and also because of during pandemic they have to stop their job. It's yeah, I support a lot with the women's like I established the group, and then our group is now we start working support the women in the rural area specific in Aileu, Mobisi, and then also we working close with the university, UNTL, Timor-Leste University, UNTL. We'll do some activity. The first one is that we will do the open space activity. This open space I learned from when I was working with the Center for International Conflict Resolution, and then also with Belun, and then also I got the training from the Philippines last year, and then I will implement that training to the women vulnerability, and then the group I identify is like people with disability, LGBTI, and then also student, and then we will do next month or next few months. Now we're still planning. It's been like even 6 months I don't have a job, but I do a lot of activity with the women and then girls and students. And then I also joined the research with the one woman to monitor, to find that the issue about the student when they study during the COVID-19. They study in Delhi. They have to stay with the family. Some family not receive me the good, not like some discrimination in the family. And then I also working on that, and then find more issue to do in my own research with the one friend now. And then this is because of the pandemic. There's some students, they're living with the family or the friend, and sometimes they also have the discrimination, and then something like challenges for them to stay with their family. This is the one. This is like during the pandemic, 6 months. 6 months. My group, I will publish, like we call like a women's group, but that group is recognized because I do the relation with the other international NGO, and then also they will support us, our group. Few months later, we will find the funding, and then we will do the activity. The activity is socialization, and then also open space training. I will do to the community, special identify the people with disability, women's group, and then the student. I think that
right.
I will do for this.
Thank you very much, Abela, for your concrete suggestions as well as what you're going to do personally. Jesuina, do you have any addition? Jesuina, you have to unmute.
Yeah, thank you. I just want to say that Belun in its program continue to support women's group in the rural areas, including young girls that we trying to mobilize them to be a peace actors. But dealing with the pandemic situation, it is Belun also have trying to find some support from the from Belun from no ito niya konsul ito niya benene trying to find some support from people to help some vulnerable schools at the rural area in the eastern part and the western. So this is for now. This is I can say this is a difficult time to trying to mobilize more in this situation because of the limitations of some limitations deal with the funds. But we still have an initiative to trying to assist women groups that we that before we have support them with small grants to build their economic. We still have a contact with them, and sometimes we invite them to really to sharing their experience on how to survive with their economic.
Thank you very much, Jesuina. Yes, thank you. And we hope that you're actually able to get all the support that you need to actually further help and assist the women that you are working with. So, ladies and gentlemen, that's the time that we all have. I would like to thank our panelists. Thank you so much to Bylah, Jesuina, Timor-Leste, Meghna, Bangladesh, and Tamara from Singapore for sharing their insights on the topic of women, peace, and security in the time of in the midst of COVID-19. As mentioned earlier at the beginning of the program, this is the first webinar series from APPAP in general, as well as the working group on gender and atrocity prevention in particular. Our intent is to center on women, peace, and security in the midst of the pandemic. What does it look like? How can we continue to work on WPS despite the multi-level, multi-layered concerns and exclusions? And we've heard from our speakers. The current situation brought many challenges, but at the same time, we must nonetheless create the spaces to ensure perspectives, experiences, and leadership of women are brought into the fore. So on behalf of the Asia Pacific Partnership for Atrocity Prevention, or APPAP, Working Group on Gender and Atrocity Prevention, we thank you all, and we wish you all well. Keep safe. So that's it. Thank you so much once again to the participants, and thank you so much once again to our panelists, and have a good day. Bye.